$500 million. That is the conservative estimate of what was stolen from one African kingdom in a single act of colonial violence that the world still refuses to fully reckon with. Not stolen centuries ago in some murky, undocumented past. Stolen in 1897. Within living memory of people who are grandparents today. Stolen by a modern nation-state with a paper trail, with names on orders, with photographs of the loot being packed into crates. And today, those stolen treasures sit in the British Museum, in museums across Germany, Austria, and the United States, where the people they were taken from are told to be patient, to fill out the right forms, to wait for committees to deliberate. For the African diaspora, this is not ancient history. This is the economics of cultural dispossession playing out in real time. This is a story about how a civilization that mastered bronze casting 500 years before Europe industrialized it was deliberately recast as primitive. It is a story about who controls the narrative of African greatness, and what it costs when that control is surrendered. But it is also a story about survival, about what cannot be taken, and about the people who are fighting right now to bring it all back home. The Kingdom of Benin, located in what is today southern Nigeria in Edo State, was one of the most sophisticated and powerful states in pre-colonial Africa. This was not a village. This was not a tribe in the dismissive, reductive sense that colonial language preferred. This was a kingdom with a centralized government, a professional army, elaborate trade network stretching across West Africa and reaching into the Mediterranean, and an artistic tradition so technically advanced that when the first Europeans encountered Benin Bronzes in the late 15th century, they refused to believe Africans had made them. They speculated wildly about lost Greek colonies, about mysterious outside influences, because the alternative, accepting that black Africans had produced art of such extraordinary refinement, was simply incompatible with the ideology that justified their presence on the continent. The Oba of Benin, the divine king at the center of this civilization, presided over a court of immense ritual complexity. The bronzes, which are technically brass, cast using the lost wax method known as Repatriation, were not decorations. They were historical records. They were religious objects. They were the living memory of the kingdom encoded in metal, depicting obas and warriors, ceremonies and conquest, the cosmology of a people who understood themselves to be at the center of the world. By 1897, Benin City was a thriving metropolis surrounded by walls that stretched for over 10,000 miles in total, the largest earthwork structure in human history. The Oba at the time was Oba Ovanramwan Nogbesai. He was a man governing a sovereign nation. What happened next was not a clash of civilizations. It was a robbery with military cover. In January of 1897, a British acting consul general named James Robert Phillips led an unauthorized expedition toward Benin City. He had been denied permission to enter during a sacred festival period. He went anyway. Benin forces, interpreting the armed advance as an invasion, which it was, ambushed the party and killed most of them. The British government used this as the justification it had been looking for. In February of 1897, a punitive expedition of over 1,200 British soldiers under the command of Admiral Harry Rawson attacked Benin City. They burned it. They looted it systematically and comprehensively. Thousands of bronze plaques, ivory carvings, wooden sculptures, and royal regalia were seized and carted off. Oba Ovanramwan was captured, put on trial by the very people who had invaded his country, and exiled to Calabar, where he died in 1914. The British officers kept some of the bronzes for themselves. The rest were auctioned off by the British government to pay for the cost of the expedition. The Foreign Office sold the culture of a people to cover the bill for destroying it. The bronzes ended up dispersed across Europe and North America, acquired by museums and private collectors who asked no difficult questions. Augusta's Pitt Rivers received hundreds of pieces. The British Museum acquired a significant collection. The objects were renamed, recontextualized, stripped of their Benin identity and reclassified as curiosities, as ethnographic specimens, as African art in the catch-all colonial category that erased the specific, sophisticated civilization that had created them. The looting was documented. The British soldiers photographed it. There are photographs of Benin City in flames, photographs of bronzes stacked like plunder, because that is exactly what they were. What was deliberately suppressed in the aftermath of 1897 was not simply the physical objects but the entire intellectual and cultural framework that gave those objects meaning. Colonial administrators and their academic allies worked systematically to dismantle the historical memory of Benin's sophistication. Early British accounts of the punitive expedition described Benin City as a place of barbarism, of human sacrifice, of darkness, specifically to construct a retroactive moral justification for the attack. These accounts were not neutral observations. They were propaganda, and they were extraordinarily effective. The narrative that Africa had no real history, no real civilization, no real art worthy of the name, was embedded into the educational systems of colonial territories and into the museums of Europe. Felix von Lusken, the director of the African collections at the Berlin Ethnological Museum, who acquired hundreds of Benin Bronzes after 1897, acknowledged their extraordinary artistry but still classified them under ethnography rather than fine art, a curatorial decision that was entirely ideological. The distinction between ethnography and fine art in European museums was not aesthetic. It was racial. Greek vases were art. Benin Bronzes were artifacts. This distinction shaped how generations of people, African and European, were taught to understand African creative achievement. In Nigeria itself, the British colonial administration actively suppressed the political authority of the Oba, stripping the institution of its power and working to delegitimize the spiritual and cultural traditions connected to the court and its material culture. The guilds of bronze casters who had maintained these traditions across generations were disrupted. The economic systems that had supported the production of royal bronzes were dismantled. The intent was not simply to steal objects but to make the civilization that produced them appear to have never really existed, to convert a history of achievement into a vacancy that colonialism could justify filling. What was erased, most profoundly, was the understanding that African people had already solved problems of governance, aesthetics, metallurgy, and historical record-keeping that Europe claimed as its exclusive inheritance. What survived is the more powerful story. The Igan Eramwan, the Royal Guild of Bronze Casters in Benin City, never stopped working. This guild traces its origins to the 14th century, to the reign of Oba Ogola, who according to oral tradition brought a brass caster named Egega from the Yoruba city of Ife to establish the tradition in Benin. The guild is hereditary. Its membership passed from father to son across more than 600 years of unbroken practice. Today in Benin City, in the workshops of Igan Street, where the guild still has its home, you can watch men and women practicing the same lost wax casting technique that produced the bronzes now locked in European museums. The technique survived the burning of Benin City. It survived colonial suppression. It survived because it was held in human bodies and transmitted in human relationships that no punitive expedition could fully reach. The oral traditions of the Edo people, the custodians of Benin's cultural legacy,